Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. Thank you for stopping by. Today we're going to take a look at the front brake caliper on my 1981 Honda CM400C motorcycle. Now the reason we're going to be taking a look at this is because it seems to be sticking. When I wheel the bike around in the garage here, I can hear it kind of squeaking and it feels like it might be dragging. And when I squeeze the brake lever, it actually feels kind of stiff, as if one of the pistons is stuck. Now this old bike runs really well and everything is in pretty good shape on it, but it really doesn't get that much use. And it's been sitting here in the garage since probably late last summer and really hasn't moved. Now it's spring now. I took it out a couple of days ago to kind of test it out and get it ready for the riding season, and I noticed the issue with the brake. So we're going to take things apart here, have a look, and see if we can figure out what's going on. I've got the bike up on its center stand, so the front wheel more or less has no weight on it. And what I'm going to do now is pull the brake caliper off by loosening and removing these two bolts. I'm going to use a 12mm socket on the smaller lower bolt. I'll use a 14mm socket on the larger upper bolt. Okay, so the caliper should now be free to kind of pivot off the bike here. So the first thing I'll do is check and see if the pads are worn, and they actually look like they're still in pretty good shape. So nothing to worry about there. The next thing I want to check is whether or not the caliper slides are sliding properly. So the way these work is that the bottom mounting point of the caliper is actually a sliding bushing, and you should be able to see here that I'm able to slide it in and out. There's kind of a boot around it, and there is sort of a little bit of grease kind of leaking out around it, which is probably pretty normal, but it's moving freely, which is really kind of what I'm looking for, and it's still pretty well lubricated. It's not dried out or anything like that, so that should be okay. So now the top mounting bolt itself, it doesn't have that same sliding bushing. The caliper actually slides on sort of the pin shoulder here, as you may be able to see. So what we want to look at here is whether or not the pin is dried out, and you can see there's still plenty of grease on it. And if I look here where the pin slides into, it looks like this boot is in good shape and it's still moving, and I can tell that there's grease in and around it. So from what I can tell, the caliper looks like it's moving in here just fine. So I don't think that's the issue. The way the brake pads are mounted in the caliper is there are two pins that are in sort of the base of the caliper here and held on with this bracket. Each of the brake pads has holes in it to slide on those pins. And you can see here that these brake pads are moving just fine on those slide pins. So I don't think those are binding up either. But what I want to do now is remove the brake pads so that I can take a look at the pistons here behind them and see if those are moving or not. In order to remove the brake pads, I'm going to need to remove this clip so we can pull these two pins out. So rather than fight with the caliper while it was up in the air and hung by the bungee cord, I've put it back on the rotor temporarily just so that it'll hold in place while I loosen this bolt on the caliper slide clip. So with the bolt removed, I can just slide this clip down so the fat part of this keyhole lines up to the ends of the pins, and I can pull it off. And now I should be able to work these pins out, although I'll probably need to get a pair of pliers to do that. Okay, now that that clip is removed, I should be able to just push these pins out the back of the caliper. Now they're a little tight in there, so I'm going to grab a pair of pliers and just kind of pull them. Okay, so now the pads should just come out of here. Now when I take these out, I kind of want to keep track as to which pad is which, but the telltale sign here, of course, is the two circles on the pad that contacts the two pistons. But anyway, we'll just set these aside for now. So what I'm going to do now is take my vice grip clamps and I'm going to try and push each one of these pistons back. I'm going to try and do this without loosening the cover on the brake fluid reservoir up on the handlebars, just so I don't make a mess. Now I did take a look and there is empty space in there, so these should be able to push back. If your reservoir is full, you may not be able to push back on these. I'm going to put a rag on the outer part of the caliper just so I don't scratch up the paint. Okay, so I'm just putting gentle pressure on the piston, and I can feel, and maybe you guys can even see, that it is moving kind of back inside the bore. And when I let go of the clamps, the piston does kind of push back out a little bit, of course, because there is some pressure in there with the brake fluid. So I think this piston is moving okay. So now I'm going to repeat the process on the other piston just to see if that one is moving as freely as the first one is. And when I push back on that piston, that one seems okay too. So I'm a little surprised. I really thought one or both of these pistons were seized in their bore, and that may be what was causing my problem. So I think what I'm going to do is just clean everything up, lubricate all the moving parts, and put it back together and see what happens. Maybe it was just a little bit stiff from not having been used. Okay, so like I said, I really didn't do anything here other than kind of clean everything up inside the caliper here. Now, I didn't use any brake cleaner or anything like that, so I've just kind of cleaned all the loose material out of here with a rag, and I think we're good to go. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up these slide pins. Now, even though we saw that the pads were moving freely on these slide pins, if you take a closer look, there's some old grease and stuff kind of gummed up on there, brake dust and whatnot. So I'm going to clean these up good with some brake cleaner and then re-grease them before I put them in. So I'm going to clean up the brake pads too, but I'm going to pay attention to the holes in the ears that slide on the pins there, just to make sure all the gunk in there is cleaned out too. Now, of course, if you're putting on new brake pads and maybe new hardware, you're not going to have to worry about all this. I'm going to start reassembling everything now. I'm reusing my old brake pads because I know they only have less than 1,000 miles on them, but the procedure is the same whether you're using old brake pads or brand new ones. So anyway, I'm dropping these into the caliper with the ears facing down. Now I'm putting my pads back in the same way that they came out. You can see that I have the rings from the pistons on this one, so they're going to go against the piston. If you're using new brake pads, it shouldn't matter which one goes where. So now that I've got all the old junk cleaned off the pins, I'm going to put some fresh lubricant on them, and just a little bit, because when I slide it through here, it's going to tend to want to squeeze that lubricant off. So I'm actually going to do this in 2 stages. Put a little on first so that it goes through good, and then put a little in there after it gets seated. So I'm going to take the end of the slide pin that has this collar on it and put that towards the piston side of the caliper. Now I'm going to keep an eye on this. You guys may not be able to see it in the camera, but I'm going to line that pin up to the holes in the ears on the pads. Okay, so now I've got the first one through. Alright, so now I'll repeat the process on the second pin. So now that I have the first pin in one side of the pads, all I have to do now is push down on the pads. There's a spring sort of in the caliper there until the pin lines up with the hole in the ear on the pad. Okay, and I've got that through. So I've got the pads pushed together and up against the pistons there. And I'm just going to put just a small amount of grease in here on the slide pins where I can see them. Now we don't want to put too much on here. We want to put just enough to coat those pins and make sure that the slide pins will slide, and not so much that it'll kind of goop off and get on the pad surfaces and on the rotor. So what I'll do now is slide the pads back to the other side and sort of repeat the process here where I can see the slide pins on the inner part of the caliper. So what I'm going to do next is I want to push this slide bushing out of here. So there's a look at the slide bushing. So now I'll just take a look at the boot, make sure there's no rips or cracks or anything, and it looks good. Okay, and now I'm going to pull the rubber boots out of the caliper. Okay, so I'm going to just inspect these for rips and tears before I put them back on the bike, and they look like they're okay, no issues. I'll take a look inside the ear where the slide pin and boots go and make sure there's no dirt or grime or any evidence of any kind of scoring. Everything seems good, so I think we can put some fresh grease in here and get everything reassembled. So I'm going to add just a little bit of grease inside the boot here, and then I'm going to slide one of them onto the slide bushing with the fat end facing in towards the center of the pin. And I'm going to get this over the end of the pin so that the lip on the inside of the boot locks into the channel on the slide bushing. So I've actually got this pushed all the way through so that there's some space here between the end of the boot and the end of the pin. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and reinsert this into the bore in the caliper, and I'm going to lock this lip that's in the boot into the groove that's in the caliper here. So now to reassemble this, what I'm going to do is take the fat end of the boot and I'm going to kind of get it into the caliper bore and make sure that the lip on the edge of the boot locks into the channel that's in the caliper ear. So next up I'm going to bring the slide bushing back in and I'm going to put it into the free side of the bracket. I'm going to hold one finger on the boot so it doesn't push out, and right now it's just kind of free floating in there. So what I'm going to do now is bring the other boot onto the slide pin and kind of get it on there push it all the way over so that it's almost falling off the opposite end, so that there's a lot of free area here. And I've got it about halfway so that this groove is exposed, and I can kind of squeeze it so it'll fit into the caliper ear, but not so far that the groove on the inside of this part of the boot locks into the groove in the slide pin. So I'm going to bring this in, I'm going to get the boot kind of mounted, and now hopefully I can push this through. So now what I should be able to do is gently slide the slider back in so that it locks into the groove on the far end of the slide bushing, and then kind of push it back and make sure that this groove is locked into this channel. And you can see everything is now locked into place and moving the way that it should. And then I'll wipe off some excess grease here. Next up, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull off the boot for the other slide pin. Okay, and I'll take a look at it and make sure it's in good condition. This one looks like it is. And I'll take a look at the raceway here, make sure everything looks good. I don't feel any evidence of any grit or anything in there, so I think we're good to go. We'll put a little bit of grease in there. So now I'll put the bushing back in, and I'm going to insert it so that this lip on the bushing engages to the raceway in the mounting ear. And then I'll put just a little bit more fresh grease inside the boot there. So I'm ready to put the caliper back on. I'm going to make sure that the pads are spread far apart, and I'm just going to work this over the rotor. I'm going to line up this mounting ear with this rubber boot, and I'm going to line up the slide bushing with this mounting hole on the bike. I'm going to take a look at the larger of the two bolts, the actual slide pin. I'm going to clean off the old grease that's on it. I'm going to inspect this too, make sure that there's no scoring or junk on there. Looks pretty clean, so I'm going to add some fresh grease to it. One thing to note about this slide pin is that there is a groove on it that locks into a lip on the rubber boot here once it's all tightened up. Okay, so I'm going to line everything up, and I'm going to get the pin inserted. Okay, so I've got the threads started just so that the bolt won't back out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide the caliper back a bit and make sure that I work that boot into that groove. Okay, that feels like it's locked into place. I'm just going to snug that up for now. I'll get the lower slide bushing lined up. I'm going to clean any excess grease off of this bolt, but we don't really need to add any grease to it since the bushing does all the sliding and this bolt just holds everything in place. I got that finger tight, and now I'm just going to kind of work the caliper back and forth a little bit by hand, make sure it looks like everything is moving. It feels like it is, so I'll tighten these up now. I'm sure there are factory recommended torque settings for these bolts. I don't have them on hand. I'm just going to go by experience and feel. You want to make sure you don't under tighten or over tighten these. Okay, and I almost forgot, I got to put the clip on that holds the slide pins in place. I should have done this earlier in the process so that you guys could see it better, but basically what's going to happen is these keyhole slots are going to slip over the ends of the slide pins, and then it'll push it down so that the narrower part of the keyway slides into the grooves on the pins. And now that that's in place, I'll just put this bolt back in and tighten it up. So I don't need to bleed the brakes on this because we didn't crack the line open or anything like that. But I do need to pump the lever here to get those pistons back where they need to be in order to engage the rotor. So now we'll just kind of pump this as if we were going to bleed them. And once I get some pressure there, okay, that feels pretty good to me. I'm going to move the car out of the way and we'll wheel this into the driveway and see how it feels. Okay, so as you saw, everything seems like it's working good. Now before, when I would just roll the bike around here in the garage and in the driveway, I'd hear the front brake kind of squeaking as I rolled it along. And as you guys can probably hear, it's not squeaking anymore either. So I'm not exactly sure what the problem was here. Maybe just some things were dirty in there and causing the pads to drag a little bit. Either way, we've got it all cleaned up and ready for the riding season. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to leave a comment or subscribe, feel free to do that as well. If you'd like to support my channel in another way, please consider visiting my Amazon store, which is linked in the description below. Thanks for watching.